So, you've built your epic tapestry of ancient lore. You've got thousands of words on myths and legends, cultural origin points, fashion, education, everything your world's past needs to feel rich and real. Now comes the hard part. How do you actually give that information to your reader without boring the blessed ancestors out of them? That's exactly what we're going to talk about in this final episode of Ancient Lore Creation from Just-in-Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. What do you think of the new intro? Did you like it? I was planning to wait until I hit like the next video after the series, but I thought it was really cool. So here it is in the final episode. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Okay, so we're going to break this episode into two main parts. First, the practical techniques, how to show, when to tell, how to tease, and yes, even how to infodump, but without causing your reader pain. Then we'll walk through 3 examples, 2 from master authors and 1 from me, so that we can talk about my own writing and what I tried to achieve. And we'll see how these techniques play out on the page. Okay, so let's get cracking with some tips and tricks for embedding ancient lore into your story without grinding your plot to a halt. The first technique is the obvious one, the one you've heard a million times. I know you have. And that is show, don't tell. So how show, don't tell works is, instead of, say, giving a lengthy exposition on how a religion has changed over time, you would instead show a character engaging in a ritual, one that they themselves think of as old-fashioned. Or you would show a character listening to a religious service in a language they no longer understand. Or you could reveal the age of a city by describing ancient architecture that is out of step with the modern districts of the city, and that lets the world speak for itself. And show don't tell is a great start, but it's certainly not the only technique, and frankly, it can create a situation where people show too much, and sometimes you just need to tell. And one of the things we are going to talk about later in the video is when and how telling can actually be more powerful than showing. You do not need to show everything in your world. You'll end up with a bloated, unreadable story. So this is about knowing when to show and how to do it effectively. So when should you show? You show when you can engagingly demonstrate your ancient lore in action. That's what brings history to life. Okay? So if you have an action people can take, then show it. The second technique, and it ties into showing, is character perspective. And that comes in 3 parts. First, you can introduce an anchor character, someone who's unfamiliar with a particular piece of lore. This allows that character to discover the world alongside the reader. And this doesn't have to be a farm boy who has no concept of anything. It could just be someone who is unfamiliar with this region's customs or this religion's myths. That curiosity gives you a natural way to reveal information through dialogue, through books, through experiences, or even through social faux pas. You can have the character do something dumb and be corrected as a means of this anchor character learning the religion or whatever else you're showing. The second use is to make ancient lore personal to the character. Show or tell how they feel about the ancient lore and thus make it more than dry events of history. If the ancient lore matters to the point of view character, it matters to the reader and they will remember it more. And lastly, show multiple character viewpoints on the same lore. Let different characters interpret the same ancient myth through their personal or cultural biases. This not only reveals what happened in the past, but also how it echoes differently across your world today. This is an amazing way to dig into how the myths still shape people, societies, and beliefs. Okay, so that's all your POV kind of character ways. But you can also use in-world artifacts, texts, mythos, and legends, and that is our third technique. And it overlaps a little bit with character perspectives, but it is worth calling out on its own. You can use letters, diaries, songs, inscriptions, or relics to share historical context. Maybe a character finds an old scroll or recites a folk song they learned as a child, thus giving the reader the information on the ancient lore. You can also use names to give ancient lore to the reader. Using a dead language to name places is a great way to introduce ancient lore, for example. And of course, you can actually use myths and legends, or plays and stories, or even songs as a means of communicating ancient lore. These are generally part of telling, and we'll talk more about them in a little bit. But you can also include them as flavor text at the start of your chapters. I do this in Sangwheel Chronicles. Oftentimes I have myths or legends or proverbs or sometimes a fragment of prophecy as flavor text on top of each of my chapters, and those all come from in-world ancient lore or experiences of the culture. Just remember to keep these short and relevant. They're fun, but they function like garnish. They're not the main meal. So short and sweet at the top. Technique 4 is environmental storytelling. And no, it has nothing to do with environmental conversation. It has nothing to do with environmental conservation and everything to do with letting the setting carry the lore. So using the environment to carry the lore, you can use ruins, monuments, damaged landscapes, or ancient roads that hint at past events. This lets the world itself narrate the history. Joel Rosenberg does this really well in The Sleeping Dragon. There's this desert there that's been destroyed by two dueling mages years ago, except for a single green oasis where the healing sect protected their sanctuary during this battle. And of course, the characters in The Sleeping Dragon have to go to that oasis, allowing the reader to explore this ancient lore through the desert where the setting bears testimony to the ancient conflict. And that is far more powerful than any dry recounting of the duel between these two mages. Okay, our fifth technique is strategic timing and teasing. This comes down to disclose the lore at the right time. Don't front load everything in the prologue. Most readers won't retain it, and it will kill the momentum of your story. Instead, reveal the lore when it matters, when it directly affects a plot decision or a character decision. So when a character naturally recalls or reflects on the lore is a great way to reveal it as well. Or when the lore helps to anchor a place or a moment in the reader's imagination. And you don't have to give all the lore at once. You can tease the lore instead of dumping it on the reader in one go. Give the reader a little bit, spark their curiosity, then give them a little bit more later. That gradual layering helps readers absorb and retain the lore far better than one big info blast. You got to think of this like seasoning. You don't want to overwhelm the dish. You want to sprinkle it in through key moments to enhance the flavor of your plot and characters. Okay, and then finally, let's talk about telling, not showing, and specifically when you want to use this technique with regards to ancient lore. So first, when you need quick exposition that is not central to the scene. So you want the reader to have some context, but it's not the focus of the scene. So for example, long ago the fire priests ruled the desert, but their temples were buried after the Sand War. Now, only the bone walkers remember. Boom, done. Single sentence, one line, and you can get on with a scene where the bone walkers appear. It's efficient, it's clear, and it doesn't slow the narrative down. Secondly, you want to tell more when character interiority matters. If you want to show how a piece of lore emotionally affects a character, telling can be more powerful than a whole scene of showing. For example, he hated the sound of bells. They always reminded him of funerals. They had rung through the ages, and in his heart, they never stopped. In that one moment, you've shown us personal trauma, and you've world built that funerals involve bells, and that this character carries grief inside him from the toll of the bells. You could show that, you could show bells tolling at funerals and so on, but it would take a full scene to give this context, and telling in this case is far more powerful. And finally, you should generally tell when giving the reader a myth or a legend. This allows you to use an elevated, summarizing tone, which makes the telling feel epic and authoritative. Think of Tolkien's myths, for example. And so it was that Elendil crossed the sea with the remnants of Numenor, bearing the 7 stars and the white tree. It has the feel of an ancient myth, and that is exactly what you want. You want myths and legends to feel like an old tale passed down through generations. And telling suits that kind of lore perfectly. So use your telling voice when you're giving people myths and legends. Alrighty, so those are your key techniques for revealing ancient lore. 1, show when you can dramatize it and it will impact the reader. Tell when it's cleaner and clearer and when you're emphasizing the interiority of the character. Time your reveal strategically and tease when you need to. Use characters, artifacts, the environment, and myths to make your world feel lived in. Okay, so these techniques are great and all, but what does this actually mean in action? I certainly learn more from examples than just talking about it. So let's move into some examples, starting with Tad Williams and the Dragon Bone Chair. Okay, so I'm going to start by reading an excerpt from the Dragon Bone Chair. It's close to the start of the book, so you don't need context for this really. And then while I'm reading, I want you to make notes in the comments about which techniques you spot in the passage. And then we'll go through my thoughts on what Tad Williams used in this passage at the end. Okay? Ready? Got your typing fingers sorted? Okay. Just for clarity and fair use, this excerpt is from the Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams and is read under fair use for educational purposes. Okay, here we go. Simon had never known any other home but the ageless castle called Hayholt, which meant High Keep. It was well named. Green Angel Tower, its loftiest point, soared far above even the eldest and tallest of trees. If the angel herself, perched on the tower top, had dropped a stone from her verdigrised hand, it would have plummeted nearly 200 cubits before splashing into the brackish moat and troubling the sleep of the great pikefish bobbling close above the centuried mud. That's a $10 word. The Hayholt was older by far than all the generations of Erkinlandish peasants who had been born, laboured, and died in the fields and villages surrounding the great keep. The Erkinlanders were only the latest to claim the castle. Many others had called it their own, but none had been able to make it wholly so. The outwall around the sprawling keep showed the work of diverse hands and times, the rough-hewn rock and timber of the rimmersman, the haphazard patching and strange carvings of the Herenstiri, even the meticulous stonework of Nabani craftsmen. But looming over all stood Green Angel Tower, erected by the undying Scythi long before men had come to these lands, when all of Osten art had been their dominion. The Scythi had been the first to build here, constructing their primeval stronghold on the headlands overlooking the Cainslaw and the river road to the sea. They had called their castle Asua. If it had a true name, this house of many masters, then Ashua was that name. The fair folk had vanished now from the grassy plains and rolling hill of the country, fled mostly to the woods and craggy mountains and other dark places inconvenient to men. The bones of their castle, a home to usurpers, remained behind. Ashua the paradox, proud yet ramshackle, festive and forbidding, seemingly oblivious to changes of tenantry. Ashua the Hayholt, it bulked mountainously above the outlands and town, hunched over its thief like a sleeping honey-muzzled bear among her cubs. Okay, which techniques did you get? Let me list mine. So first, this whole section is absolutely telling, and indeed the Dragonbone chair is written in a fairly omniscient voice and a pretty tally one. However, this is telling with texture. For example, Simon had never known any other home but the ageless castle called Hayholt. Yes, we're getting expositionary background, straight up telling, but it doesn't feel dry because we know that this place is important to the main character's perspective, and the telling is lyrical, evocative prose that makes it poetic, for me at least. Secondly, we're using a building to give this lore, an artifact of the past. And look at the descriptions we get. The outwall around the sprawling keep showed the work of diverse hands and times. In that line, Tad Williams uses architecture as a delivery mechanism for historical and cultural layering. In addition, he introduces additional bits of history without slowing down. The Rimmersmen, the Herenstiri, the Nabani, the Scythi. Each culture is characterized through their craftsmanship, and this is lore through environmental storytelling. In addition, there's a lot of teasing going on here, and later on, we will learn more about all of these cultures. And speaking of teasing, check out this line. Erected by the undying Scythi long before men had come to these lands. We get a mythic race, the Scythi, and they're not over-explained. They're placed in a vanished past position. Their works and names still haunt the present, but they are gone. This is classic teasing lore, just enough information to stir curiosity while not leaving the reader confused. And speaking of Asua, did you catch that he uses language and naming as part of his means of giving lore? For example, they had called their castle Asua, and if it had a true name, then Asua was that name. But we also know it's called Hayholt, which means high keep. And the paragraph with the name brings a lot of weight. That Asua, the Heiholt, it evokes the idea of this layered meaning of this castle and the cultural losses. It contrasts what has gone before with what is now. This is also a technique Tolkien used very extensively, and Williams followed suit in giving a place multiple names. Did you pick up any techniques I missed? Did you find all the ones I mentioned? Let me know in the comments below. And let's move on to our second example, this one from Jacqueline Carey and Cashil's Dart. Same deal as before. I'll read an excerpt from Cashil's Dart. You make comments about which techniques you spot in the passage, and then we'll go through my thoughts together. And again, for the legally minded, this excerpt is from Cashil's Dart by Jacqueline Carey and is read under fair use for educational purposes. Okay, here we go. It is not, understand, that I was bitter. Years passed in this manner, pleasant and undemanding, spent in the company of others. The adepts were kind and took shifts to teach us the rudiments of knowledge, poetry, song, and playing, how to pour wine, and prepare a bedchamber, and serve at table as pretty adornments. This I was permitted to do, providing I kept my eyes downcast, always downward. I was what I was, a whore's unwanted get. If this sounds harsh, understand too what I learnt at Cirrus House. Blessed Eloah loved me none the less for it. After all, what was he if not a whore's unwanted get? My parents had never bothered teaching me the basics of faith, caught up in the rhapsody of their mortal devotions. At Cirrus House, even the children received the benefit of a priest's instruction. He came every week, Brother Lovell, to sit cross-legged among us in the nursery and share with us the teachings of Eloah. I loved him because he was beautiful, with long fair hair he bound in a silken braid, and eyes the colour of deep ocean. Indeed, he had been an adept of Gentian house until a patron bought his mark, freeing him to follow his mystic's dreams. Ministering unto children was one of them. He would draw us up on his lap, one or two at a time, and spin us the old tales in his dreamer's voice. This is how I came to learn, then, dandled on a former adept's knee, how blessed Eloah came to be, how when Joshua ben Joseph hung dying upon the cross, a soldier of Tiberium pierced his side with the cruel steel of a spearhead, how when Joshua was lowered, and the women grieved, and the Magdalene most of all, letting the ruddy gold torrent of her hair to clothe his still naked figure, how the bitter salt tears of the Magdalene fell upon the soil, ensanguined and moist with the shed blood of the Messiah. And from this union the grieving earth engendered her most precious Son, blessed Eloah, most cherished of angels. I listened with a child's rapt fascination as Brother Lovell told us of the wandering of Eloah, abhorred by the Yeshuites as an abomination, reviled by the empire of Tiberium as the scion of its enemy. Eloah wandered the earth across vast deserts and wastelands. The legend carries on from here, but the techniques that I wanted to highlight are mostly in the passage that I read. Okay, so let's go through them. First, this is obviously a deep first-person retrospective. Jacqueline Carey delivers the law through the lens of memory. This is the personal confession from the narrator, so we get lore that is filtered emotionally. It's not given to us neutrally, it is given to us with all the feeling of Phedre reciting this lore. And of course, it is a subjective narrator which builds trust and intimacy. Contrast that, for example, with Tad Williams's passage to see the difference. This also allows the narrator to tell the lore directly because it's grounded in emotional context. It doesn't feel like an infodump, it feels like a character opening her soul. Secondly, it uses the technique of an anchor character, a character learning something. And we know that this is the case from the line, "This is how I came to learn how blessed Eloah came to be." Instead of starting with something like, "Let me tell you about Eloah," Carrie gives us the narrative scaffolding. Who taught the narrator? Where was she taught? And how it felt to learn. And we get the reason for the lore to exist in the story, which is the childhood formation of the narrating character. This passage is also a great example of telling through a story within a story, or using an in-world legend. In this text, we are hearing a myth retold, not in an authorial voice, but through Brother Louvel's storytelling. And that creates an environment where we can tell at length because it's an in-world oral tradition. And then lastly, we get a lot of emotion in the passage. This myth isn't just world building, it's the spiritual spine of the setting. Eloah's origin myth mirrors the narrator's own experience, a child born of grief and abandonment. That resonance makes the lore matter deeply to the narrator and hence the reader. It's not just about the past, it's about why the narrator believes in this mythos, and that creates a very powerful technique. How many techniques did you get? Did you spot any I didn't? Let me know in the comments. And finally, let's move on to an example from my own writing, The Lion Vessel, Book 3 in Sangwell Chronicles. The reason why I use my own writing is because I know exactly what I was trying to achieve, which makes it easier for me to explain to you. Okay. This is an action sequence where 3 characters are breaking into the Alchemy Guild. Lawrence is our POV character. Again, make those notes in the comments. Ellie held a finger to her lips and pointed down into an alleyway tucked between the Players Guild and the Tanner's Trade Hall. Lawrence adjusted his empty side sack so that it hung flat against his back, and they scrambled down in the corner, where a broken cart leaned against the wall. The pickpocket patted the shattered wheel, his voice a silken whisper. "There's an entrance to the catacombs under here. We'll need to shift the cart to lift it." Dirk shook his head and slid under the tongue of the cart. Muscles rippled under his umber skin, his elamar spiking in Lawrence's sight, as the disguised priest opened the tunnel, cart and all. Lawrence winced at the faint metallic gong, but the sound barely carried, dying in the alley stones. Dirk poked ahead past the wheel and beckoned for them to enter. "How did he do that?" Ellie whispered as she followed Lawrence under the cart. "It's all the spice he ate as a child, made his muscles grow up into monsters," Lawrence muttered as he slithered over the edge of the hole, hooking onto the rope leading below before she could ask any more questions. Only nobles wielded hobby, and Lawrence did not want his secrets revealed in this town. As he descended into the darkness, the mustiness of ancient decay enveloped him, mingling with the dry tang of old ashes. Dirk swung off the end of the line and took a hooded lantern from Lawrence. "What caused this place? It doesn't seem like a sewer." "It's the old ones' graves." Ellie took the lantern from him. "They buried their dead in their houses, burning them. The ruins piled up and made the catacombs." "By the wheel!" He ran his hand along the wall, reverence aching in his voice. She held a hand to her lips. "Come on, we gotta go west a bit and reach under the alchemists." With Dirk in the middle and Lawrence in the rear guard, they snuck through the ancient network of history and secrets. Faint echoes of their footsteps bounced off the narrow, uneven walls of the hollowed-out dwellings. He trailed a hand on the wall as Dirk had done, a vast sense of time crushing in around him. Past the corner, his fingers found a niche filled with a rude clay figurine. "What's this one?" No one knows for sure. Ellie shone the light on the little statue, revealing a woman's shape with a fox's head. "We think it's some kind of spirit from before the Consang came. There's plenty of these down here, some broken, some whole. We leave them alone, in case the spirit is still alive and becomes angry." "A wise move," Dirk murmured. His lips moved soundlessly, fingers hovering near the statue without touching it. "Come on," Ellie said. "Night won't last forever." Okay, so here is what I tried to achieve in that passage, and let me know whether you think I succeeded. First, I used lore through action. The characters are engaged in a high-stakes piece of action, and they're naturally exploring the setting and the environment, thus also learning the lore of this place. Second, I have an anchor character. Dirk asks what the catacombs are, and Ellie, the local thief, tells him that it's the Old Ones' graves where they buried their dead. And especially because they're in ruins, the info feels like discovery rather than exposition. At least that's what I was trying to achieve. Secondly, I try not to get too bogged down, but instead give some mythological information in passing. This line, for example, "We think it's some kind of spirit from before the Consang came." Here I'm providing some teasing world-building information, but also confirmation to the reader that there were many more spirits before the Consang came, and compared to how many spirits there are now after the religion of Viero, which dominates the empire in its current state. I'm also here layering my time periods. We have the current characters, the Consang, and something even older than that. And I'm also playing with the cultural memory and fear, the effects of ancient lore. And I do that by using this line: "We leave them alone in case the spirit is still alive and becomes angry." Here, I deliberately don't explain how the spirit works or even if they're dangerous. I just show how the people act on their beliefs shaped by these spirits from ancient times. And lastly, I try to bring in some emotional reactions to ground the lore. For example, with Dirk's reaction, I try to show how much reverence he feels for this ancient lore, even though it isn't his own, and I try to show how heavily the past weighs on the people of the present here. And if my world sounds interesting to you, Sangwheel Chronicles is complete, and you can purchase all 4 books on the links down below. Okay, let's do a quick summary of the techniques we've explored and compare them to each other in these examples. So, with Tad Williams and the Dragonbone chair, we had telling with texture, rich, omniscient prose that doesn't feel so exposition-y because it's evocative and tied into the home of a character we've already met, so it matters to us. We also have environmental storytelling. The castle itself is an artifact. The architecture tells the story of cultural layers of that castle. We also have teasing and naming. Ancient names like Ashua hint at lost identities and hidden legacies without over-explaining. We also have implied mythology. The Scythi are introduced not with an infodump, but with a sense of mystery and presence that haunts the setting. Then in Jacqueline Carey and with Kashiel's Dart, she used first-person emotional telling. Lore is delivered as memory, giving it deep emotional resonance. We have an anchor character. The narrator is learning the lore alongside the reader in a natural personal context. We have in-world myth and oral tradition. The legend of Blessed Elua is told in-world by a beloved mentor, anchoring it in the relationship and faith. And we have spiritual relevance. The myth isn't just history, it's identity, belief, and personal truth. And then finally, in my example, I employed the following techniques in the writing of the book. Lore through action. The characters are doing something high stakes while discovering the lore in real time. I use teased mythology. I only give bits and pieces of the mythology, not the entire history, just enough to give texture and context. At least I hope so. Cultural, I also use cultural behavior. Lore affects how people act, what they touch, what they fear, what they revere, and I try to show that through the passage. I also emotionally ground the lore. Character reactions like Dirk's reverence deepen the weight of the past on the present, which is a core theme of Sangwell Chronicles. So, applying all of this to your ancient laws, use showing when you can dramatize ancient lore through action, architecture, ritual, or character behavior. Use telling when you need clarity, emotional insight, or the cadence of myth. Anchor lore through character perspectives, either through discovering, debating, or embodying that lore. Scatter your lore through in-world texts, songs, or sayings, and reinforce it with flavor in your scenes. And let the world tell its own story through scars, ruins, and rituals that have outlived the people who originally made those artifacts. And finally, time your reveal strategically. Don't tell the whole tale at once. Let the past unfold as the story demands. Ancient lore isn't just about what happened before. It's about how the past still matters and how your characters and readers live in the shadow of the past. And if you enjoyed this series, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which examples resonated most with you, or if you're using any of these techniques in your own writing. And if you want to support the channel and get early access to videos and world building worksheets, consider joining as a member. And a very giant thank you to all of my members, especially the just-in-timers of the Stone level, Lupix Lakeshire, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamano. Thank you so much for joining me on this ancient lore Thank you so much for joining me on this ancient lore journey. Until next time, build what you need when you need it.